Now let's talk a little bit about the Truman administration and civil rights. 1947, President Truman organized a committee, authorized a committee on civil rights to look into what the situation was in the United States so far as black people and rights. Remember that book, An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal, had really opened a lot of people's eyes during the war to some of the inequities that were going on. And as I mentioned, being involved in a war against a fascist, racist state just really opened a lot of people's eyes. That committee came back with a report called To Secure These Rights, and President Truman then embarked on a civil rights program, several things that he proposed and did. One of them was that he made that committee permanent. He made it the Civil Rights Commission. He also proposed a federal law against lynching, which several people, all the way back to Ida Wells Barnett, had been trying to do and still didn't get done until just a few years ago, finally. And again, you might ask, what's the point of having a federal law against illegally murdering somebody? Well, that just makes sure that it's not a local or a state crime, so that people in the community that might approve of racist murder would be on the jury. It makes it a federal crime instead. Also, a federal law against the poll tax, which was one of the ways that black people and sometimes poor white people were being disenfranchised in the South, and equal access to jobs and education. But in 1948 came the big move. In 1948, by executive order, President Truman desegregated the United States military. That's something that, as president, he was authorized to do because the president is the commander-in-chief, the top person of the military. So rather than trying to get something through Congress, because it pertained to the military, he just signed off on the order, and bang, the Army was desegregated. And a lot of white people in the military didn't like the idea. A lot of white people around the country didn't like the idea. Some of the arguments that were given included that unit cohesion and morale would be affected in a negative way, that white soldiers would be so embarrassed, humiliated, and disgusted to have to serve directly with black people that they wouldn't do a very good job anymore, and that they would become dispirited, and that they wouldn't join the military, and that they wouldn't want to stay in the military, and all these things, and that military units would fall apart in combat because black and white people fighting on the same side is just impossible because they would all hate each other. And that didn't come to pass. Those were some of the same arguments, by the way, that were used against allowing gay people to serve openly in the military for the longest time. To give you an idea how seriously people were taking civil rights in the United States in 1948, in that year, the Democratic Party added civil rights as a plank to their party platform. Now, remember, a platform is all the things a party stands for. And so the metaphor is it's like a stage. And so all the things that make up that overall thing are planks. So civil rights is one of the things that the Democratic Party was claiming was their main focus. That was the most progressive platform the Democratic Party had ever had. And it was the first time since Abraham Lincoln, since Reconstruction at least, first time in, let's say 65 years at least, that a major political party had made civil rights one of their main issues. And at the Democratic National Convention that summer, the summer of 1948, in Philadelphia, one of the keynote speakers was this guy, the mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey. keynote speaker at the national convention for Democrats and Republicans is usually somebody that is kind of young and is viewed as a promising rising star. And so that was the case here with Mayor Humphrey, who said in his speech, as he's talking about the importance of civil rights, he said,
to those who say, my friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
most of the people were cheering Humphrey, but some people were booing. Those people that were booing were the Southern delegates, almost all of whom turned right around and walked out of the hall and left the convention at that moment. In fact, they formed a third party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, who were referred to colloquially as the Dixiecrats. They ran as their candidate for president Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, a very pro-segregation person, which was appropriate because whereas the one of the planks of the Democratic platform was civil rights, segregation wasn't a plank in the Dixiecrat platform, it was the whole platform. Strom Thurmond, by the way, would later be the senator from South Carolina and would serve for like 55 years. He served till he was like 100 years old in the early 2000s. So when they were running for president against both the Democrat and the Republican, one of the assertions that Strom Thurmond made was that Truman's plan to use the federal government to end segregation was fascism and would convert America into a Hitler state. In other words, if they don't let us be racist and segregate people, it's like Hitler. So that was the far right conservative wing of the Democratic Party. Turns out the far left, most liberal wing of the Democratic Party was also unhappy with Truman. And they broke off, and they also formed another party. In their case, because they thought that Truman wasn't being liberal enough. So they named their new party the Progressive Party, and they ran for president Henry A. Wallace, who had been Roosevelt's second vice president. He had not had him run with him as vice president in 1944 because by that point, Wallace had already shown himself to be way, way, way to the left of everybody and was proving to be a political liability. So Wallace, the presidential candidate for the Progressive Party that also split off from the Democrats, he wanted a friendly relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and in his campaign for president, openly welcomed support from the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. Now, in some ways, that's very broad-minded. In other ways, in 1948, at the very height of the Cold War, running for president and inviting communists to come along is not a way to get votes. Robert Taft ran for the nomination for the Republican candidate, but that's not who the Republicans chose. They chose Governor of New York, Republican Thomas A. Dewey. And this is just a demonstration of how different times were back then compared to the 21st century. So we've seen that the Democrats, who generally are thought of today as the party that is left of center, they were being left of center, but then there were some of them that were being way to the right and some way to the left. The guy that ran against Truman as a Republican was a liberal Republican, which is something that still existed as recently as the 1970s and 1980s. And there were a few of them left in the 1990s. What does it mean to be a liberal Republican? That means that you are conservative where economics are concerned, but progressive or liberal on social issues. Now, Dewey led in all the polls. That's in part because Truman was heading up a party that was split in three parts, right? The Dixiecrats split off, the new Progressive Party split off, and we've talked before about how when that happens, it always hurts somebody, and it sure was looking like it was going to hurt Harry Truman. The one thing that Truman had going for him in running against Thomas A. Dewey is that he was running against Thomas A. Dewey, who kind of tended to shoot himself in the foot. He was not the best public speaker. He was considered to be kind of bland and boring and wishy-washy, which means that you don't take a firm, decisive stand on anything. And that was demonstrated in some of the things that he said. And a columnist for the Louisville Courier Journal kind of pointed that out when he was referring to some of Dewey's quotes when he said, quote, "No presidential candidate in the future will be so inept that four of his major speeches can be boiled down to these historic four sentences. Agriculture is important. Our rivers are full of fish. You cannot have freedom without liberty. Our future lies ahead." Well, yeah, I mean, duh. That's kind of the point. So Dewey wasn't the best candidate, but he was still leading Truman by substantial margins. With Truman's popularity already declining, and now the Democratic Party split, not only split, but split three ways, everybody, practically everybody, just assumed that Dewey was going to have a huge victory in the election, and polls seemed to support this. Potential voters, when polled, said they were more likely to vote for Dewey. So in the final month of the campaign, Dewey tried really hard not to do or say anything controversial because all he had to do to win was essentially not shoot himself in the foot, not stumble. So he became even more bland than usual, I guess you could say. And Truman, who was, you could say a lot of things about Truman, but he was not bland. He was very blunt and very outspoken by nature, became much more blunt and much more outspoken in the last month of the campaign, and he started really hammering the opposition. Dewey, but even more so, the Republican-controlled Congress, which he called the Do-Nothing Congress. So he essentially was addressing his own unpopularity because his things that he tried to get done hadn't gone through, and turn that around and say, well, it was all because of the Republicans. And, well, these are a couple of quotes, "those bloodsuckers on Wall Street." He also said that GOP, which, if you didn't know, stands for Grand Old Party, and started being applied to the Republican Party after the Civil War. He said GOP stands for gluttons of privilege. And then, to the surprise of virtually everybody, Truman actually won. He not only won, he won big. And the polls right up until Election Day were still indicating that Dewey was going to win big. But when people got to the polls, turns out that's not how it went, as you can see, with Truman getting 49 0.6%, almost 5 percentage points more in the popular vote than Dewey, and winning 28 states opposed to Dewey's 16. Notice that Thomas E. Dewey's running mate, the person who would have been vice president and probably on that morning thought he was going to be vice president, was Earl Warren. Remember that name because he is going to be coming back into our story before not very long. Now, you'll notice that 4 states went to neither of them, but to the Dixiecrats, the states' rights Democratic Party, who ran Strom Thurmond. You'll see that the Deep South, excluding Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, all went for the Dixiecrats, which their only difference from the norm was that they were for segregation, and that was their main point. And you'll notice that one district in Tennessee went for them as well. But I said that this came to the surprise of virtually everybody, and that includes the Chicago Daily Tribune, whose editors were so confident that Dewey was winning and, in fact, had won that on election day, late the night of the day of the election, they went ahead before all the votes had been counted and set their headline for the next morning. Dewey defeats Truman, which turns out was, fake news, I guess you could say. Inaccurate. They jumped the gun on that one. So here is President Truman gleefully showing that newspaper, which was completely wrong. He had been underestimated, not for the first time, and he was going to get 4 more years. Now, for context, because I've kind of jumped around a little bit because I was talking about foreign policy earlier, it was after this election and during the second administration of Truman that the Korean War happened. That started in 1950. This was the election of 1948. Hey, 1950. That sounds like a good segue.